When the worst blizzard in 40 years came howling down on the Wolf Creek country, it trapped Margaret Tunstall in a snowbound cabin with Dade Renton, the one man on God's earth she despised above all others. She'd sooner have frozen in the open. She told herself that first black night, than owe her life to the man right across the creek. By the time the spring thaw finally opened the passes and set her free to leave, she'd have given almost anything not to have to go. Margaret Tunstall, Maggie, though few were close enough to call her so, was a proud woman, and she came by the pride honestly, having earned every hard inch of it. She ran the Tunstall Ranch alone in the Wolf Creek country, had run it alone for the 4 years since her husband Vern died, and she ran it well, asking no man for help and accepting none offered. She was capable, and she was stubborn, and she was about as warm to her neighbors as the country was in January. And she was, above all, the proud keeper of a grudge. The grudge was against Dade Renton, who ranched the land adjoining hers, and it was older than her widowhood. Years back, Maggie's husband Vern and Dade Renton had fallen into a bitter feud over the creek in the strip of bottomland that ran between their two places, the only good water for miles, in a country where water was everything. Vern had told Maggie the whole sorry tale 100 times, that Renton was a hard, grasping, land-hungry cheat who'd tried to steal the Tunstall water, cut their access, and made Vern's life a misery over a creek that was rightly half the Tunstall's. Maggie had believed every word, because Vern was her husband and she'd loved him. And when Vern died, of fever, 4 years back, the feud still unsettled, Maggie inherited the ranch, the water dispute, and the grudge all together, and she'd nursed that grudge ever since. To Maggie Tunstall, Dade Renton was the man who'd embittered her husband's last years, the grasping cheat across the line, the one human being in the Wolf Creek country she truly despised. She had never once in all those years actually sat down and talked with him. You don't talk with a man you despise. You nurse your contempt and you keep your distance, and you assume you know everything you need to know. The blizzard ended the distance. It came down without much warning, the way the killing storms do. A savage early blizzard, the worst the country had seen in 40 years. And it caught Maggie Tunstall out in the open. She'd ridden up into the high country after a handful of strays, too proud and too stubborn to leave good stock to the weather, and the storm closed over her like a fist. A whiteout so total she lost the trail, lost her direction, lost everything but the killing cold soaking into her bones. Her horse foundered in a drift. She went down, and Margaret Tunstall, proud and capable, and entirely alone, understood with terrible clarity that she was going to die out there in the white, miles from her own hearth, and that no one even knew she'd ridden out. She did not die because Dade Renton found her. He'd been out in the storm himself, doing the same fool stubborn thing she had, bringing in his own stock ahead of the weather, and he came upon her foundered horse and then her, half buried and freezing near gone, and Dade Renton, the man she despised, got her up out of the snow and onto his own horse, and fought his way through the whiteout to the nearest shelter, which was a line cabin on the boundary between their two places, and got her inside, and got a fire going, and saved her life. And then the storm sealed them in. It snowed for 3 days without stopping, and when it finally quit, it had buried the Wolf Creek country under drifts 10 feet deep, the passes choked, the world gone white and silent. There was no leaving. The little line cabin, a one-room shelter stocked, by the grace of habit, with firewood and a store of basic provisions against exactly such an emergency, became the whole of Maggie Tunstall's and Dade Renton's world, and would remain so, they slowly realized as the snow piled higher, not for days but for weeks. Two bitter enemies, snowbound together, with no prospect of parting until the spring thaw. The first days were ice inside the cabin, as much as out. Maggie was furious, at her own helplessness, at owing her life to the one man she'd despised for years. She was prickly and cold and proud, and she made it plain she'd accept his shelter only because the alternative was death, that she'd be gone the instant the snow allowed, and that nothing between them had changed. And Dade Renton, for his part, was gruff and quiet, and gave her a wide berth, a hard, solitary man with no more idea what to do with an enemy under his roof than she had. But a one-room cabin in a 40-year blizzard does not permit the keeping of distance for long. Survival is a great leveler of pride. They had to share the fire or freeze, ration the food together or starve, split the long cold work of staying alive. And you cannot share survival with a person, day after day after day, without beginning, against all your will, to truly see them. And what Maggie Tunstall began to see, as the long snowbound weeks wore on, was that Dade Renton was nothing at all like the man she'd despised for years. The grasping cheat of Vern's stories simply wasn't there. In his place was a gruff, quiet, fundamentally decent man, hard-working even snowed into a cabin, scrupulously fair in the rationing, unfailingly careful of her comfort and her dignity in the close quarters, giving her the better blankets and the warmer corner, without a word, and taking the cold himself. He was a man of few words, but the few were honest. He was, she came slowly to understand, as lonely as she was, a widower himself, she learned, his own wife years gone, ranching alone the same as she did, carrying his own quiet griefs. The longer the winter pressed them together, the harder it became for Maggie to square the man actually in front of her. Patient, fair, kind in his gruff wordless way, with the villain she'd hated for years on her dead husband's word. It was a hard sickness, midwinter, that broke the last of the ice between them. Maggie took a fever, the cold and the strain of it, and went down hard, helpless for the better part of a week, and Dade Renton nursed her through it. The man she'd despised sat up with her through the fever nights, cooled her, fed her broth a spoonful at a time, tended her with a gentleness she'd never have believed of the grasping cheat of Vern's stories, and asked nothing, and never once made her feel her helplessness as a shame. When the fever broke and Maggie surfaced weak and clear-headed to find Dade Renton dozing in the chair beside her, worn out from a week of tending his enemy, something in the proud hard shell she'd carried for years simply cracked and fell away. Why? She asked him, when she was strong enough. After everything, the feud, the way I've treated you, the things I've believed about you for years. You pulled me out of the snow. You've given me the warm corner and the better food all winter. You sat up a week nursing a woman who's despised you for years. Why would you do all that for me? And Dade Renton, in the close quiet of the snowbound cabin, finally told her the truth about the feud. The truth that turned everything she thought she knew on its head. I never hated Vern, he said slowly, and I surely never tried to steal your water. That's not how it went, Mrs. Tunstall, whatever he told you. He looked into the fire. That creek and that bottomland, they were honestly disputable. The line was never clear, and there was plenty of water in it for both our places if we'd shared it sensible. I told Vern that the first year, I offered to split it down the middle, fair and square, surveyed and legal, so we'd both have water for good and no quarrel. He turned me down. I offered to share it on a handshake. He turned me down. I offered, more than once over the years, to buy or sell or split or share any way he liked, anything to end the bad blood, and every single time Vern Tunstall turned me down flat because Dade stopped gentling it as best he could. Because your husband was a proud man, ma'am, a stubborn one. He'd decided I was his enemy, and he'd sooner have a feud he could be righteous about than a fair deal that meant admitting the other fellow wasn't a villain. I'm sorry to say it of the dead, and I'll say no more than that. But I never cheated him. I spent years trying to make peace with him, and he wouldn't have it. The grudge you inherited, it was never built on anything I did. It was built on Vern's pride. Maggie Tunstall sat with that a long, hard while, because it cost her something terrible to hear. And worse, because she knew in her honest heart that it was true. She had been married to Vern's pride for 20 years. She knew exactly how stubborn he'd been, how he'd sooner break than bend, how he'd hold a grievance past all sense, rather than admit he might be the one in the wrong. She had told herself the feud was Dade Renton's villainy, because that was what Vern had needed it to be. But she knew her husband, and she knew his pride, and the moment Dade laid the truth out plain, she recognized it for the truth it was. She had despised an innocent man for years on the strength of her own dead husband's stubbornness, and she, proud Maggie Tunstall, who had inherited not just Vern's ranch but Vern's pride along with it, saw, with the painful clarity the long winter had forced on her, that she'd been every bit as stubborn as Vern, nursing a hatred she'd never once examined, because examining it would have meant letting go of her righteousness. "I've despised you for years," she said quietly, "for a thing you never did. I believed Vern because believing him was easier than questioning him. And I never once gave you the chance to be anything but the villain I'd decided you were." She drew a breath, and the pride that had armored her whole life gave way to something braver. "I'm sorry, Dade. Truly. You've shown me more decency snowed into this cabin than I showed you in all the years before it, and I've nothing to offer in return but an apology that's years too late and the admission that I was wrong about you, root and branch." "You weren't wrong," Dade said gently. "You were loyal to your husband. There's no shame in that. You just got loyal to the wrong story, and the way he said it, without triumph, without a trace of getting even. Just a quiet kindness toward the woman who'd wronged him. Undid the last of Maggie Tunstall's contempt entirely, and left in its place something she had not felt in the 4 lonely years of her widowhood, and had not expected ever to feel again. With the feud laid bare and the pride set down, the two of them, 2 lonely, capable, stubborn people who'd wasted years as enemies, found in the close quiet of the cabin exactly the company each had been missing. They talked, through the long white evenings, the way Maggie hadn't talked with anyone since Vern died, about their lives, their losses, the hard solitary business of ranching alone, the things they'd each given up hoping for. Dade's gruffness, she found, was only the armor of a shy and lonely man, and under it was dry humor and deep steadiness. And Maggie's prickly pride, Dade found, was only the armor of a woman who'd had to be hard to survive alone, and under it was warmth and courage and a quick, fine mind he came to look forward to all day. Snowed into one room with the person each had most despised, they discovered, week by thawing week, that they were precisely what the other had been starving for. And somewhere in the deep of that hard winter, neither of them could have said, exact day, contempt finished turning into respect, and respect into warmth, and warmth into the thing neither of them had any business feeling for an old enemy, and neither of them could stop. The proud widow fell in love with the man she'd despised. And Dade Renton, who'd long since given up on anything but a solitary life, fell just as hard for the woman the blizzard had blown into his cabin and his heart. When the spring thaw finally came, when the passes opened and the snow drew back off the Wolf Creek country and the world let them out at last, they could have gone their separate ways, back across the line, back to their 2 ranches and the old division between them. By every expectation of the autumn before, Maggie Tunstall should have ridden home the instant she could and been glad to put Dade Renton behind her, forever. Instead, on the first clear morning the trail allowed, the 2 of them stood outside the cabin that had trapped them together all winter, looking at the open country and the line between their lands, and neither one wanted to cross it alone. "Well," Maggie said, and her voice wasn't quite steady, "the snow's gone. I can go home now." "You can," Dade agreed. He turned his hat in his hands, gruff and shy as the day she'd met him. "Or," he stopped and made himself say it, "or there doesn't have to be a line anymore, Maggie, between your place and mine. There's water enough for both, like I always said, and there's no reason 2 people who found out they'd rather be snowed in together than free apart should go back to ranching alone on opposite sides of a creek." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to stay, to join your land to mine and your life to mine, and end the feud the only way it ought to have ended 30 years ago. Not with a survey or a lawsuit, but with the 2 of us on the same side of the water for good. I love you, Maggie Tunstall. The blizzard blew the one person into my cabin I'd have sworn I'd never want, and turned out to be the one I can't imagine doing without. Don't go home, make this home. Stay." And Margaret Tunstall, proud, stubborn, set free at last from the inherited grudge and the armor of her own pride by one long hard winter, snowed in with the man she despised, set the last of it down, and chose warmth over pride for the first time in her life, and said yes. They married that summer, and they joined the 2 ranches into one, and the contested creek that had divided the Tunstalls and the Rentons for 30 bitter years simply ran, from then on, through the middle of one family's land, instead of along the border of 2 enemies. The feud Vern's pride had built and Maggie's pride had inherited ended not in victory for anyone, but in a marriage, which is the only way such things ever truly end. And the Wolf Creek country, which had watched the Tunstals and the Rentons snipe at each other across that water for a generation, watched the two of them build a long, good life on the joined land instead, and marveled at it. Maggie told the story herself in her old age, usually with a rueful shake of her head at the proud, hard woman she'd been. That blizzard trapped me in a cabin with the one man on earth I despised, she'd say. 40-year storm snowed us in the whole winter, and I spent the first week of it wishing I'd frozen rather than owe Dade Renton my life. She'd smile then, the way you smile at your own old foolishness. And by the time the spring thaw set me free to go, I couldn't bear to leave him. Took a blizzard to do what nothing else ever could have. Sit my pride down in one room with the truth and not let either of us out till I'd looked at it square. I'd hated that good man for years on a story my husband's stubbornness built, and I never once questioned it till the snow gave me no choice. She'd take Dade's hand. Everything had changed by spring. The feud was over. The pride was gone, and I'd found, at the far end of the worst winter of my life, the best thing in it. Sometimes the Lord has to snow a stubborn woman in for a whole season just to make her sit still long enough to see what's been across the creek whole time.